Part 1, Chapter 4B of The Adventures of Jimmie Dale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. The Adventures of Jimmie Dale by Frank L. Packard. Reading by Mary Rhodey. Part 1, The Man in the Case. Chapter 4B. The Counterfeit 5 continued. Step by step, testing each one against a possible creaking of the floor, Jimmie Dale moved forward, keeping close up against one wall. The man passed on into the room, and now Jimmie Dale could distinguish every word that was being spoken, and, crouched up in the dark corridor, in the angle of the wall and the door jamb itself, could see plainly enough into the room beyond. Jimmie Dale's jaw crept out a little. A young man, gaunt, pale, wrapped in blankets, half sat, half reclined in an invalid's chair. The old lady on her knees, the tears streaming down her face, had her arms around the sick man's neck, while the other man, apparently upset at the scene, tugged vigorously at long gray mustaches. "Sammy, Sammy," sobbed the woman piteously. "Say you didn't do it, Sammy. Say you didn't do it." "Look here, Mrs. Matthews," said the man with the gray mustaches, gently. "Now don't you go to making things any harder. I've got to do my duty just the same, and take your son." The young man, a hectic flush beginning to burn on his cheeks, gazed wildly from one to the other. What is it?" he cried out. The man threw back his coat and displayed a badge on his vest. "I'm Kline of the Secret Service," he said gravely. "I'm sorry, Sammy, but I want you for that little job in Washington at the Bureau, before you left on sick leave." Sammy Matthews struggled away from his mother's arms, pulled himself forward in his chair, and his tongue licked dry lips. What job?" he whispered thickly. "You know, don't you?" the other answered steadily. He took a large, flat pocketbook from his pocket, opened it, and took out a $5 bill. He held this before the sick man's eyes, but just out of reach, one finger silently indicating the lower left-hand corner. Matthews stared at it for a moment, and the hectic flush faded to a grayish pallor, and a queer, impotent sound gurgled in his throat. "I see you recognize it," said the other quietly. "It's open and shut, Sammy. That little imperfection in the plate's got you, my boy." "Sammy, Sammy," sobbed the woman again. "Sammy, say you didn't do it." "It's a lie," said Matthews hoarsely. "It's a lie. That plate was condemned in the Bureau for that imperfection. Condemned and destroyed." "Condemned to be destroyed," corrected the other, without raising his voice. "There's a little difference there, Sammy. About 20 years' difference, in the federal pen. But it wasn't destroyed. This note was printed from it by one of the slickest gangs of counterfeiters in the United States. But I don't need to tell you that. I guess you know who they are. I've been after them a long time, and I've got them now, just as tight as I've got you. Instead of destroying that plate, you stole it, and disposed of it to the gang. How much did they give you?" Matthews' face seemed to hold a dumb horror, and his fingers picked at the arms of the chair. His mother had moved from beside him now, and both hands were patting at the man's sleeve in a pitiful way, while again and again she tried to speak, but no words would come. "It's a lie," said Matthews again in a colorless, mechanical way. The man glanced at Mrs. Matthews as he put the $5 note back into his pocket, seemed to choke a little, shook his head, and all trace of the official sternness that had crept into his voice disappeared. "It's no good," he said in a low tone. "Don't do that, Mrs. Matthews. I've got to do my duty." He leaned a little toward the chair. "It's dead to rights, Sammy. You might as well make a clean breast of it. It was up to you and Al Gregor to see that the plate was destroyed. It wasn't destroyed. Instead, it shows up in the hands of a gang of counterfeiters that I've been watching for months. Furthermore, I've got the plate itself. And finally, though I haven't placed him under arrest yet, for fear you might hear of it before I wanted you to and make a getaway, I've got Al Gregor where I can put my hands on him, and I've got his confession that you and he worked the game between you to get that plate out of the burro and disposed of it to the gang." "Oh, my God!" It came a wild cry from the sick man, and in a desperate, lurching way he struggled up to his feet. "Al Gregor said that? Then I'm done." He clutched at his temples. "But it's not true, it's not true. If the plate was stolen, and it must have been stolen or that note wouldn't have been found, it was Al Gregor who stole it. I didn't, I tell you. I knew nothing of it, except that he and I were responsible for it, and I left it to him. That's the only way I'm to blame. He's caught, and he's trying to get out of it with a light sentence, by pretending to turn state's evidence, but I'll fight him. He can't prove it. It's only his word against mine, and—" The other shook his head again. "It's no good, Sammy," he said, a touch of sternness back in his tones again. "I told you it was open and shut. It's not only Al Gregor. One of the gang got weak knees when I got him where I wanted him the other night, and he swears that you are the one who delivered the plate to them. Between him and Gregor and what I know myself, I've got evidence enough for any jury against every one of the rest of you." Horror, fear, helplessness seemed to mingle in the sick man's staring eyes, and he swayed unsteadily upon his feet. "I'm innocent," he screamed out, "but I'm caught in a net, and I can't get out. They lied to you. But no one will believe it any more than you do, and it means 20 years for me. Oh, God, 20 years, and—" His hands went wriggling to his temples again, and he toppled back in a faint into the chair. "You've killed him! You've killed my boy!" the old lady shrieked out piteously, and flung herself toward the senseless figure. The man jumped from the table across the room, on which was a row of bottles, snatched one up, drew the cork, smelled it, and ran back with the bottle. He poured a little of the contents into his cupped hand, held it under young Matthew's nostrils, and pushed the bottle into Mrs. Matthew's hands. "Bathe his forehead with this, Mrs. Matthews," he directed reassuringly. "He'll be all right again in a moment. There, see, he's coming around now." There was a long fluttering sigh, and Matthews opened his eyes, then a moment's silence, and then he spoke with an effort, with long pauses between the words. "Am I to go now?" The words seemed to ring absolute terror in the old lady's ears. She turned and dropped to her knees on the floor. "Mr. Kline, Mr. Kline," she sobbed out. "Oh, for God's love, don't take him. Let him off. Let him go. He's my boy, all I've got. You've got a mother, haven't you? You know—" The tears were streaming down the sweet old face again. "Oh, won't you, for God's dear name, won't you let him go? Won't—" "Stop!" the man cried huskily. He was mopping at his face with his handkerchief. "I thought I was case hardened. I ought to be. But I guess I'm not. But I've got to do my duty. You're only making it worse for Sammy there, as well as me." Her arms were around his knees now, clinging there. "Why can't you let him off?" she pleaded hysterically. "Why can't you? Why can't you? Nobody would know, and I'd do anything. I'd pay anything, anything. I'll give you $10,000–$15,000. "My poor woman," he said kindly, placing his hand on her head, "you are talking wildly. Apart altogether from the question of duty, even if I succeeded in hushing the matter up, I would probably at least be suspected and certainly discharged, and I have a family to support, and if I were caught I'd get 10 years in the federal prison for it. I'm sorry for this. I believe it's your boy's first offense, and if I could let him off I would." But you can!" she burst out, rocking on her knees, clinging tighter still to him, as though in a paroxysm of fear that he might somehow elude her. "It will kill him! It will kill my boy! And you can save him! And even if they discharged you, what would that mean against my boy's life? You wouldn't suffer. Your family wouldn't suffer. I'll take care of that. Perhaps I could raise a little more than 15,000. But oh, have pity, have mercy. Don't take him away." The man stared at her for a moment, stared at the white face on the reclining chair, and passed his hand heavily across his eyes. "You will! You will!" It came in a great surging cry of joy from the old lady. "You will! Oh, thank God! Thank God! I can see it in your face." "I guess I'm soft," he said huskily, and stooped and raised Mrs. Matthews to her feet. "Don't cry any more. It'll be all right. It'll be all right. I'll fix it up somehow. I haven't made any arrests yet, and well, I'll take my chances. I'll get the plate and turn it over to you tomorrow. Only it's got to be destroyed in my presence." "Yes, yes," she cried, trying to smile through her tears, and then she flung her arms around her son's neck again. "And when you come tomorrow I'll be ready with the money to do my share, too, and—" But Sammy Matthews shook his head. "You're wrong, both of you," he said weakly. "You're a white man, Kline, but destroying that plate won't save me. The minute a single note printed from it shows up, they'll know back there in Washington that the plate was stolen and—" "No, you're safe enough there," the other interposed heavily. "Knowing what was up, you don't think I'd give the gang a chance to get them into circulation, do you? I got them all when I got the plate. And," he smiled a little anxiously, "I'll bring them here to be destroyed with the plate. It would finish me now as well as you, if one of them ever showed up. Say," he said suddenly, with the catch in his breath, "I don't think I know what I'm doing." Mrs. Matthews reached out her hands to him. "What can I say to you?" she said brokenly. "What—" Jimmie Dale drew back along the wall. A little way from the door he quickened his pace, still moving, however, with extreme caution. They were still talking behind him as he turned from the corridor into the passageway leading to the store, and from there into the store itself. And then, suddenly, in spite of caution, his foot slipped on the bare floor. It was not much, just enough to cause his other foot, poised tentatively in the air, to come heavily down, and a loud and complaining creak echoed from the floor. Jimmie Dale's jaw snapped like a steel trap. From down the corridor came a sudden, excited exclamation in the little old lady's voice, and then her steps sounded running toward the store. In the fraction of a second Jimmie Dale was at the front door. "Clumsy, blundering fool!" he whispered fiercely to himself as he turned the key, opened the door noiselessly until it was just ajar, and turned the key in the lock again, leaving the bolt protruding out. One step backward, and he was rapping on the counter with his knuckles. "Isn't anybody here?" he called out loudly. "Isn't any— Oh," as Mrs. Matthews appeared in the back doorway, "a package of cigarettes, please." She stared at him, a little frightened, her eyes red and swollen with recent crying. "How did you get in here?" she asked tremendously. "I beg your pardon?" inquired Jimmie in polite surprise. I locked the door, I'm sure I did," she said more to herself than to Jimmie Dale, and hurried across the floor to the door as she spoke. Jimmie Dale, still politely curious, turned to watch her. For a moment bewilderment and a puzzled look were in her face, and then a sort of surprised relief. "I must have turned the key in the lock without shutting the door tight," she explained, "for I knew I turned the key." Jimmie Dale bent forward to examine the lock, and nodded. "Yes," he agreed with a smile, "I should say so." Then, gravely courteous, "I'm sorry to have intruded." "It is nothing," she answered, and, evidently anxious to be rid of him, moved quickly around behind the counter. "What kind of cigarettes do you want?" "Egyptian," "Any kind," said Jimmie Dale, laying a bill on the counter. He pocketed the cigarettes and his change and turned to the door. "Good evening," he said pleasantly, and went out. Jimmie Dale smiled a little curiously, a little tolerantly. As he started along the street, he heard the door of the little shop close with a sort of super careful bang, the key turned, and the latch rattled to try the door. The little old lady was bent on making no mistake a second time. And then the smile left Jimmie Dale's lips. His face grew strained and serious, and he broke into a run down the block to Sixth Avenue. Here he paused for an instant. There was the elevated, the surface cars. Which would be the quicker? He looked up the avenue. There was no train coming. The nearest surface car was blocks away. He bit his lips in vexation, and then, with a jump, he was across the street and hailing a passing taxicab that his eyes had just lighted on. "Got a fare?" called Jimmie Dale. "No, sir," answered the chauffeur, bumping his car to an abrupt halt. "Good!" Jimmie Dale ran alongside and yanked the door open. "Do you know where the Palace Saloon on the Bowery is?" "Yes, sir," replied the man. Jimmie Dale held a $10 banknote up before the chauffeur's eyes. "Earn that in 4 minutes, then," he snapped, and sprang into the cab. The taxicab swerved around on a little better than 2 wheels, started on a mad dash down the avenue, and Jimmie Dale braced himself grimly in his seat. The cab swerved again, tore across Waverly Place, circuited Washington Square, crossed Broadway, and whirled finally into the upper end of the Bowery. Jimmie Dale spoke once, to himself, plaintively. "It's too bad I can't let old Carruthers in on this, for a scoop with his precious Morning News Argus, but if I get out of it alive myself I'll do well. Wonder if the day'll ever come when he finds out that his very dear friend and old college pal, Jimmie Dale, is the Gray Seal that he's turned himself inside out for about 4 years now to catch, and that he'd trade his soul with the devil any time to lay hands on. Good old Carruthers! The most puzzling, bewildering, delightful crook in the annals of crime. Am I?" The cab drew up at the curb. Jimmie Dale sprang out, shoved the bill into the chauffeur's hand, stepped quickly across the sidewalk, and pushed his way through the swinging doors of the Palace Saloon. Inside, leisurely and nonchalantly, he walked down past the length of the bar to a door at the rear. This opened into a passageway that led to the side entrance of the saloon on the cross street. Jimmie Dale emerged from the side entrance, crossed the street, retraced his steps to the Bowery, crossed over, and walked rapidly down that thoroughfare for 2 blocks. Here he turned east into the cross street, and here, once more, his pace became leisurely and unhurried. "It's a strange coincidence, though possibly a very happy one," said Jimmie Dale as he walked along, "that it should be on the same street as the Sanctuary. Ah, this ought to be the place." An alleyway corresponding to the one that flanked the tenement, where as Larry the Bat he had paid room rent as a tenant for several years, in fact, the alleyway next above it, and but a short block away, intersected the street, narrow, black, and uninviting. Jimmie Dale, as he passed, peered down its length. "No light, that's good," commented Jimmie Dale to himself. Then, "Window opens on alleyway 10 feet from ground. Shoe store, Russian Jew, in basement. Go in front door, straight hallway, room at end, Russian Jew probably accomplice. Be careful that he does not hear you moving overhead." Jimmie Dale's mind, with that curious faculty of his, was subconsciously repeating snatches from her letter word for word, even as he noted the dimly lighted, untidy, and disorderly interior of what, from strings of leather slippers that decorated the cellar-like entrance, was evidently a cheap and shoddy shoe store in the basement of the building. The building itself was rickety and tumble down, 3 stories high, and given over undoubtedly to gregarious foreigners of the poorer class, a rabbit burrow, as it were, having a multitude of roomers and lodgers. There was nothing ominous or even secretive about it. Up the short flight of steps to the entrance, even the door hung carelessly half open. Jimmie Dale's slouch hat was pulled a little farther down over his eyes as he mounted the steps and entered the hallway. He listened a moment. A sort of subdued, querulous hubbub seemed to hum through the place, as voices, men's, women's, and children's, echoing out from their various rooms above, mingled together and floated down the stairways in a discordant medley. Jimmie Dale stepped lightly down the length of the hall and listened again, this time intently, with his ear to the keyhole of the door that made the end of the passage. There was not a sound from within. He tried the door, smiled a little as he reached for his keys, worked over the lock, and straightened up suddenly as his ear caught a descending step on the stairs. It was 2 flights up, however, and the door was unlocked now. Jimmie Dale opened it, and, like a shadow, slipped inside. And as he locked the door behind him, smiled once more. The door lock was but a paltry makeshift at best, but inside his fingers had touched a massive steel bolt that, when shot home, would yield when the door itself yielded, and not before. Without moving the bolt, he turned, and his flashlight for a moment swept the room. "Not much like the way they describe this sort of place in storybooks," murmured Jimmie Dale capriciously, "but I get the idea. Mr. Russian Jew downstairs makes a bluff at using it for a storeroom." Again the flashlight made a circuit. Here, there, and everywhere, seemingly without any attempt at order, were piles of wooden shipping cases. Only the center of the room was clear and empty, that and a vacant space against the wall by the window. Jimmie Dale, moving without a sound, went to the window. There was a shade on it, and it was pulled down. He reached up underneath it, felt for the window fastening, and unlocked it. Then cautiously tested the window itself by lifting it an inch or two. It slid easily in its grooves. He stood then for a moment, hard-faced, a frown gathering his forehead into heavy furrows, as the flashlight's ray again and again darted hither and thither. There was nothing, absolutely nothing in the room but wooden packing cases. He lifted the cover of the one nearest to him and looked inside. It was quite empty, except for some pieces of heavy cord and a few cardboard shoe boxes that in turn were empty too. "It's here, of course," said Jimmie Dale thoughtfully to himself. "Clever work, too. But I can't move 100 packing cases without that chap below hearing me. And I can't do it in 10 minutes, either, which, I imagine, is the outside limit of time. Fortunately, though, these cases are not without their compensation. A dozen men could hide here." He began to move about the room. And now he stooped before one pile of boxes and then another, curiously attempting to lift up the entire pile from the bottom. Some he could not move, others, by exerting all his strength, gave a little. And then, finally, over in one corner, he found a pile that appeared to answer his purpose. "These are certainly empty," he muttered. There was just room to squeeze through between them and the next stack of cases alongside. But once through, by the simple expedient of moving the cases out a little to take advantage of the angle made by the corner of the room, he obtained ample space to stand comfortably upright against the wall. But Jimmie Dale was not satisfied yet. Could he see out into the room? He experimented with his flashlight, and carefully shifted the screen of cases before him a little to one side. And yet still he was not satisfied. With a sort of ironical droop at the corners of his lips, as though suddenly there had flashed upon him the inspiration that fathered one of those whimsical ideas and fancies that were so essentially a characteristic of Jimmie Dale, he came out from behind the cases, went across the room to the case he had opened when he first entered, took out the cord and the cover of one of the cardboard shoe boxes, and with these returned to his hiding place once more. The sounds from the upper stories of the tenement now reached him hardly at all, but from below, directly under his feet almost, he could hear someone, the proprietor of the shoe store probably, walking about. Tense, every faculty now on the alert, his head turned in a strained, attentive attitude, Jimmie Dale threw on the flashlight's tiny switch, took that intimate and thin metal case from his pocket, extracted a diamond-shaped gray paper seal with the little tweezers, moistened the adhesive side, and stuck it in the center of the white cardboard box cover, then tore the edges of the cardboard down until the hole was just small enough to slip into his pocket. Through the cardboard he looped a piece of cord, placard fashion, and with his pencil printed the 4 words, "With the compliments of," above the gray seal. He surveyed the result with a grim, mirthless chuckle, and put the piece of cardboard in his pocket. "I'm taking the longest chances I ever took in my life," said Jimmie Dale very seriously to himself, as his fingers twisted and doubled and tied the remaining pieces of cord together, and finally fashioned a running noose in one end. The cord and the flashlight went into his pocket. The room was in darkness. The black mask was whipped from his breast pocket and adjusted to his face, and his automatic was in his hand. Came the creak of a footstep, as though on a ladder exactly below him, another and another, receding curiously in its direction, yet at the same time growing louder in sound, as if nearer the floor. Then a crack of light showed in the floor in the center of the room. This held for an instant, then expanded suddenly into a great luminous square, and through a trap door, opened wide now, a man's head appeared. End of Part 1, Chapter 4, B.